This morning, we're going to be talking about citizen rights and responsibilities. And so we're talking about citizenship. And citizenship is a status that entails specific rights, duties, and benefits. And how do you get to be a citizenship? Well, most of us were born here. That's birthright citizenship, and it's extended by the 14th Amendment. And it's important to note that birthright citizenship also belongs to people who are born in any of our U.S. territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Mariana Islands. In addition, a person can become a naturalized citizen, and a naturalized citizen is someone who was born in another country, who comes here, goes through a process, and at the end of that process takes an oath of allegiance to the United States. Citizenship can also be gained through acquisition, and acquisition citizenship is enjoyed by a person who is born in another country but has one or both parents who are United States citizens. So we're talking again about the rights of citizens. And what's a right? A right is a moral or legal entitlement to have something or to be able to do something. So starting with that moral right. Moral rights are often held in common by people who share a culture or a religion, or there's some basis for them to agree on the moral standards of that group. Later on, those moral standards may become a legal entitlement, a legal right, which is then codified and becomes a legal right, which then is a fundamental normative rule about what people are allowed to do and what people are owed in this society according to the legal system. So we came to this country, this is back at the beginning of the founding. They came to this country with this concept of natural rights, which was sort of a moral right. Natural rights is a concept where the belief is that certain rights are held by people just because they're people. They're born with these rights, and they don't depend on a culture or a government to give them those rights. Those rights are theirs, and those rights are universal, fundamental, and inalienable. And so, as I said, at the time of our founding, there was a belief in natural rights, and that the King George, had been interfering with those natural rights and were oppressing people, and so there was a revolution. And one of our founding documents actually proclaims that we, the people, have a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So here we are again with that word right. So the revolution is fought. The United States starts to form as an independent country, and it forms around our United States Constitution. And the Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. And then again, that word rights. And those Bill of Rights contain our freedoms, our freedom of speech, press, religion, association. The Bill of Rights contains some privacy rights, and they also contain protections for people who are accused of crimes. So these are all fundamental rights that came into being at the very beginning of our country's founding. So we also need to be alerted to the fact that the Bill of Rights, although they were said to belong to everybody, they actually did not belong to enslaved people, and they didn't belong to Indians at the beginning of our country's founding. So we go ahead in our history of the United States, and we fight this Civil War, and the Civil War is fought over the issue of slavery. The North wins, and the South has to come back into the Union. And at that time, there were 2 additional amendments to the Constitution that would bring those Southern states and the people who had been enslaved there back into the Union. And the 14th Amendment reads, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So there are two things about this that I would like to make especially clear. It begins, no state shall. That establishes the federal government's oversight over all states conforming to this ideal of rights that belong to everyone. And the second thing is that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And we're going to go into that a little bit in a minute. But I want to bring you to the 15th Amendment, another post-Civil War amendment, which reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which means the people who were enslaved. Now, Black men get to vote. Again, we have to note that at this time, women were not permitted to vote. So let's march along in time and watch what happens. Our Constitution passes we passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and it takes effect in 1920. And it says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So women now get the right to vote. So you see this right, the idea of rights continues to expand over time. Coming forward into the year 1961, we now begin to expand that right further through the 23rd Amendment, which gives people in the District of Columbia the right to vote in presidential elections, because up until that time, they couldn't vote in presidential elections. So again, we're expanding the right to vote. And then finally, in 1971, we expand the vote to give it to younger people. The voting age is lowered from 21 to 18 years old. And now we have more people eligible to vote. So the question becomes, these are rights that are enshrined in our United States Constitution. There's an arduous process that brings us to the point where we've actually got an amendment to the Constitution. And the people did that because it was important. Can voting rights be taken away? Well, yes, the answer is yes. And in Ohio, you can forfeit, a person forfeits a right to vote if that person is incarcerated for a felony conviction, and that means you're actually in jail at the time of the election. If you get out of jail the day before the election and you're registered to vote, you can vote. You are not eligible to vote if you've been declared incompetent for voting purposes by a probate court. And you are not eligible to vote if you have been permanently disenfranchised for the violation of election laws. So remember when I said earlier that the amendment said that states could not deprive people of right of life, liberty, and property without due process. I want to note that each of these processes through which a person became ineligible to vote, there was due process. You were convicted of a felony in a court. You were found incompetent in a court, and a court found you to have violated election laws, and you were therefore disqualified from voting. So I'm spending a lot of time now here talking about voting, and because it's one of our major rights, and it's both a right and a responsibility. So let's look a little at the responsibilities of citizenship. And I want to bring us back again to our founding. Our form of government was found on the ideal of social contract, which meant that the government is actually an agreement among us. We've decided we're going to be self-governing and we're going to govern ourselves according to these laws and these rules. And we're a republic. So the power of government, that government we created among ourselves, is restricted so that it will not interfere with the natural rights that we all enjoy because we're people and we were born with them. So let's go back again some more to the citizens' responsibility in the early founding of our country. And again, people gathered in communities, and the community residents had kind of a mutual responsibility for each other. They organized themselves because they depended on each other. They depended on each other for protection. Of course, someone from the outside would threaten them. They depended on each other for social services in case someone was sick or disabled. And they depended on each other for public improvements. So although these activities were technically voluntary, there were actually social consequences for not living up to these commitments in these very early communities. Let's say we're in a community together and we want to build a road. We really need a road from point A to point B. So we decide among ourselves that on Saturday, everybody's going to go out and they're going to build their road. And everybody's going to bring their wagon and they're going to bring their shovel and they're going to bring whatever else they have at their disposal. And they're going to work together until this road is built. But let's say that Saturday morning comes and I don't want to go. I'm tired. I've been working all week and I just don't feel like it. And my foot hurts and I don't want to go. You can believe that there were social consequences that I would pay and my family would pay because I'm going to use the road, but I didn't help to build it. So that's kind of what the community control, how they organized themselves early on. Well, let's fast forward now to the year 2020. And I was there. The year 2020. Now we are more organized, and residents now have a more sophisticated structure. And we rely on our elected officials, institutions, and our laws to enforce many of the responsibilities of citizenship. We actually use the Constitution. Article 1 allows us to collect taxes so that we can take care of the roads and bridges that need to be built, support for people who are sick or disabled, and also to raise an army in case we are invaded. So we're now a little more sophisticated about that, and we really don't use social pressure to make each other go out and build roads. Now, there's some other the responsibilities of citizenship are brought to us also through that oath that I said, that when people are immigrants to this country and then they become naturalized citizens of this country, that they take an oath of allegiance. Well, within that oath, they promise to take on the responsibilities of citizenship because they now have acquired the rights of citizenship. And those responsibilities are support and defend the Constitution, stay informed about issues that affect the community, participate in the democratic process, which would mean voting, and respect and obey federal, state, and local laws. So how do you actually do that? How do you actually support and defend the Constitution? Well, we know that we sometimes have to raise an army. We sometimes have to fight a war. So every man has to register for the Selective Service. You turn 18, you go down to wherever you go down and you get a form and you register for the Selective Service, or you don't do it by computer probably now. So you have to do that, and there actually is a consequence if you don't do that. There's a possibility of a $250,000 fine and 5 years in prison if you fail to fulfill that responsibility. But it is a responsibility. Another similar responsibility is jury service. A citizen may be called to serve on a federal, grand jury in a state court, or a jury in a municipal court. And remember how we talked about those protections that are in the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the Constitution? Well, among those rights are the right to a jury trial. Well, here we are. Now we have to have people that serve on the jury. So we have a right to a jury trial, but then as citizens, we have a responsibility to be part of that jury. So when our name comes up and we're called, we receive a jury summons, we have to respond to that summons. Now there's sometimes reasons that you are excused from jury service, but you have to respond to that summons or there's a consequence. So let's look a few more of those kind of rights and responsibilities, how they work. You have a right to use a city street, but you have a responsibility to pay the taxes that maintain those streets. You have a right to education. Your children have a right to an education, but you have a responsibility to send your child to school. We have compulsory education laws, and we can't keep our kids home unless they're sick. We have a right to work. We have a right to work wherever we choose, or a right to work with whoever will hire us. But we may have a responsibility to pay union dues. We have a right to our own bodily integrity. We can walk where we want, we can dress as we want. But in this age of COVID, we have to wear a mask. We're in public spaces. So similarly, I want to look at those restrictions on our rights. We do remember earlier we talked about the right to vote, but it's restricted if you're in jail on voting day. So we have other kinds of rights and restrictions. We have a right to free speech. We can say anything we want, except we actually can't tell lies about each other and tell lies so that the community hears that lie. We're subject, this is not a criminal penalty, but we are subject to a civil penalty in a defamation lawsuit against us. And the courts will hear those claims that I lied about you, and people heard it and believed it. Freedom of a press. I can publish anything I want to in my newspaper, but I cannot publish child pornography in my newspaper because we have laws against child pornography because we want to protect our children. And I have freedom of movement. I can go anywhere I want, except I can't trespass on private property. So those rights and responsibilities play back and forth within our system of government, and it's helpful to understand them that way. You get a right, but you also have a responsibility. So that's actually the end of my presentation, but I want to go over a couple of frequently asked questions. Here's the first one.
So if I can just jump in really quick, Trudy, and about those rights you were just talking about and some of the aspects of them, all of those limits you talk about are where the rights of an individual causes harm to somebody else. So your right can't cause harm to somebody else. So the lying about other people, it's not just lying, it's lying that would cause somebody else harm. So that's what libel or slander are. It's a lie that materially hurts somebody else. And that freedom of movement, you're right, trespassing could be intruding on somebody else's freedom of space. So that's a harm. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater because that could cause a panic. But again, the only limits on those are where they would cause harm to others, and that's really where those boundaries are.
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up, because that does capsulize those responsibilities and those restrictions. My first frequently asked question is, what is the difference between a right and a privilege? And a right is available to all people, as we said. A privilege is granted to individuals based on their status, rank, title, or membership in a group. And we're talking a lot about privilege now in these days. And I think it's important to recognize that while people have rights to move freely in space, in the space where they live, some people don't have the privilege to go in that same space without being challenged about their right to be there. That's difference between right and privilege in this day. And the second frequently asked question I had is, what are human rights? It's something else we hear about. It's sort of linked to natural rights that I talked about earlier, but it's a broader topic because they are, as these are human rights that belong to all people, they have sort of been formalized as being universal through a 1948 Declaration of Human Rights that was created by the United Nations, which set forth the principle that people have human rights because they're human, and they have a right to be universally protected in those rights. So I wanted to bring out those two concepts because they're talked about a lot. I think that concludes. Does anybody have any questions? Anything more, Chris?
No, I would, well, let me just jump in one last time with you. You brought up the mask thing about, like, normally we have the right to wear whatever we want, and right now they're asking people to wear a mask. And the only reason they have the right to do that is, again, because of that idea that your freedom can't harm somebody else. And so right now, because you can demonstrate that not wearing a mask said disease so easily, that's the justification for that mask rule. And if they didn't have that, if there wasn't this disease that was spreading, they couldn't just mandate that people have to wear masks for no reason. And those laws will get challenged in court. In fact, people are probably challenging the mask laws in court, but the government will be able to show that there's harm for not wearing it. But again, the idea is that your freedom should be as much as possible until it hurts somebody else. And that applies to all of these, and it's important to remember that when they were putting these together, it was trying to balance that, and it's not always easy to tell where that balance point is. And so it's okay to have disagreements on where that balance point is, as long as we're willing to discuss it in a civil way with people.